This is the harbour of the small town of Rathmullen on the shores of Lough Swilly in County Donegal. It's in the north of Ireland, a good deal further north than Belfast as a matter of fact, but it's not in official Northern Ireland. It's in today's Irish Republic. And yet, the history of modern Northern Ireland starts here. Because it was from here, nearly 400 years ago, on the 4th of September 1607, that a ship that had come from the continent sailed secretly away, carrying with it into sad voluntary exile in Europe the last of the great Catholic Gaelic Irish chieftains to try and prevent English rule becoming effective in Ireland. The great Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone. With O'Neill went his family and retainers and his young ally, the Earl of Tyrconnell. It was the English crown that had made them both earls, and yet now they were going. Why? They'd been in rebellion some years before, but had been defeated and pardoned. Finding themselves deprived of all real power in their own lands, they were leaving in despair. The events known as the Flight of the Earls, and it changed the course of Irish history. Because O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, and Tyrconnell had left so unexpectedly, it made it easy to think that they were up to something treasonable. All their lands, a vast area stretching right across Ulster, were now declared forfeit to the Crown. Many English who'd fought O'Neill and Tyrconnell's father in their great rebellion of some 10 years before had long been wanting to get their hands on these lands. Now they were up for grabs officially, and grabbed they were. The counties of Donegal, Derry, Fermanagh, Tyrone, Cavan and Armagh were planted with English and Scottish settlers. Politically, it was thought that this would bring Ulster finally within the English peace. There'd been other such plantations in Ireland in the century before, but they'd withered away. To this colonizing plantation of Ulster, the government was determined to give real permanence. The Honourable, the Irish Society, you'd almost think it was a very important personage. In fact, this brass plate in the city of Derry embellishes the office of that Honourable, the Irish Society, which after 1610 was given the job of colonising, civilising was then very much the thought, those parts of the former lands of the flown earls which lay hereabouts, and all of which were now forfeit to the English crown. The Irish Society, similar in purpose to the East India Company of the day or the Virginia Society for colonizing America, the Irish Society, indeed it was, which changed the name of the city from Derry to Londonderry. And Derry's links with the city of London, maintained over many centuries, are still celebrated today as formally as ever. To the City of London was given the undertaking of settling not only Derry itself, but the whole county. The land was given to wealthy city companies, haberdashers, skinners, drapers, salters. There's a draper's town and a salter's town there to this day. In County Londonderry, the drawing board scheme was that almost all the land was to go through the city companies to Scottish and English settlers who weren't allowed to take Irish tenants. A small part of the county, about 5%, went to former soldiers who were allowed Irish tenants. The rest of the county, about 10%, went to the native Irish, who'd once had all of it, and whom the Crown now charged double the rent it charged the settlers. It was, too, to the less fertile lands on the hills that most of the native Irish were to be confined. A similar scheme was drawn up for the other confiscated counties. The Irish again were to have the less fertile lands. In fact, the scheme didn't quite work out as on the drawing board. Settlers did come in, but many Irish, in fact, were left on the settlers' land despite the new regulations, being wanted either as labourers or as tenants who could be charged high rents. The settlers fortified their farms, living daily among Irish whose rights to land here they'd displaced. They made themselves secure against whatever might be being prepared for them in the hills and woods outside their windows. However peaceful the scene outside, however industriously the settlers might work the land, they were not a massively planted colony at all, but isolated individuals. So from the very start, something goes wrong with the main political point of the plantation. The chance of totally colonizing the forfeited counties is lost. And there are two very important psychological results from this. First of all, the Catholic Gaelic Irish, while actually occupying a good deal more land than had originally been allotted to them, feel no less resentment because, of course, they regard the land as theirs in the first place. Secondly, the Protestants, less numerous, less physically dominant than had been intended, feel themselves, not without reason, insecure and more a beleaguered garrison surrounded by enemies than as masters in their own new homes. The really effective colonization or plantation of Ulster came about from another source. Through an originally small, unofficial settlement of Scots that had already taken place on the Ards Peninsula of Ulster's east coast. From there, coming continually across the sea from Scotland, there spread over northeast Ulster throughout the 17th century a stream of Presbyterian Scots in search of land and prosperity in a new country. Here too, the new and old populations, Protestant and Catholic, became intermingled. Prospering in this eastern settlement, these Scots Presbyterians, themselves dissenters from the official Anglican Church, spread outwards across the counties of Antrim and Down and the town of Belfast, spreading even right across Ulster to fill out some of the gaps left in the official plantation by the failure of those who'd undertaken to settle it. The mark of the two 17th century settlements of Ulster can still be seen on a map showing where Protestants are concentrated today. Donaghadee, in the heart of the Ards Peninsula or eastern settlement of Ulster. The important thing for the future, apart from the main fact that the Scots did come pouring in through the Ards Peninsula here, the important thing for the future was that as Scots, they came as Presbyterians rather than Anglicans. Presbyterians who at that time were penalized by the state here in Ireland as dissenters. On Sundays, people from towns like this actually used to row across to Scotland and back in their little boats in the course of one day to hear communion from Presbyterian ministers who were banned here in Ireland. One Sunday in the early 17th century, 500 people actually did this. It's that sort of determination on the part of Northern Irish Presbyterians to pursue what they see as their interests, both spiritual and material, that figures continuously through Irish history for the next 300 years and more, and is one of the principal factors in the situation today. So came about, gradually, the English and Scottish Protestant settlement of Ulster. Ulster, once the most Gaelic, Irish and Catholic province of all, now had a mixed population of opposed interests and beliefs, but not visibly distinguishable except that, as the new Protestant settlers put it, Catholics dug with the wrong foot. At the very start, there was fear in the minds of the new settlers. Fear of those original inhabitants who, as labourers or tenants, were all about them, and whose minds they could never quite know. Fear of those pushed to the less fertile lands, plotting perhaps out of sight to recover what had been taken over by the stranger as they brooded in resentment. Some 5,000 former swordsmen of the two Gaelic earls who'd flown still lurked in the bogs and mists. Then, on the 23rd of October 1641, it happened. A great rebellion of the Catholic Gaelic Irish, proclaiming their loyalty to the Crown, but striking swiftly and fiercely for the return of their lands. The 1641 rebellion was against all new settlements in Ireland, but the Ulster settlement was the largest, and there the effect was most shattering. This is the bridge at Portadown in Northern Ireland today. On a cold November day in 1641, a party of some 100 Protestant men, women and children who'd been brought from their homes by the rebels and robbed and stripped often even of their clothes were herded together onto the bridge that was then here. They were then thrown or driven over the parapet into the water below, where they were drowned, or if they could swim, were shot or knocked on the head as they came ashore. Some of the Irish even took to boats and bashed them with oars as they floundered in the waters. There was said to be a ghostly figure which arose from those waters for months afterwards. A woman, naked to the waist, very white, hair dishevelled, her eyes, it was said, seeming to twinkle in her head as she cried, "Revenge, revenge."
The Protestants are in the water and the Catholics are on the land there. They were fighting so that we could have the Holy Bible for reading, and the Roman Catholic wouldn't let us have our Holy Bible, and that's what it's all about.
Not quite, but there was a religious aspect to the rebellion. Catholic against Protestant. And such atrocities as the Catholic soldiers of Sir Phelim O'Neill, the Irish leader, did carry out, were made the most of by Protestant propagandists. That atrocities did take place is certain. So is the fact that they were exaggerated. One Protestant historian said Sir Phelim O'Neill's men killed 150,000, more than the entire Protestant population of the day. But atrocities did happen, usually through indiscipline rather than in any systematic way. In any case, it was what was thought to have happened that perhaps mattered most. What really did happen? Well, we know up to a point. There are some 30 volumes of what purports to be evidence collected before legal commissioners at first hand from victims of atrocities, and they're known as the depositions. The trouble is that they themselves have become a subject for dispute as much as anything in Irish history, which is saying something. Certainly, some of the evidence is mere hearsay. A lot is not concerned with Ulster at all, but with smaller settlements after the plantation in other parts of Ireland. Some is actually concerned with government atrocities. Some of it is collected 10 years after the event and is highly suspect as justifying the prosecution of Catholics whose lands people had designs on. On the other hand, quite a lot of the evidence was collected within weeks and at the most a few months of the event to which it refers, and has an unmistakable ring of truth about it. The evidence which witnesses or deponents gave was read back to them in the form of statements.
I'll be seated. Call the first witness, Elizabeth Prize of Armagh. As for this deponent and many others that were stayed behind, diverse tortures were used upon them. And this deponent for her own part was thrice hanged up to confess to money, and afterwards let down, and had the soles of her feet fried and burnt at the fire, and was often scourged and whipped. And a great number of other Protestants, principally women and children, whom the rebels would take, they pricked and stabbed with their pitchforks, skeans, and swords, and would slash, mangle, and cut them in their heads and breasts. And when these so mangled people desired them to kill them out of their pain, they would deny it. Of which she, this deponent, hath, in many particulars, been an eyewitness.
They dragged the deponent's brother, Lieutenant James Maxwell, out of his bed in the rage and height of a burning fever and cruelly butchered him. And his wife, Griselle Maxwell, being in childbirth, the child half born and half unborn, they stripped stark naked and drove her to the black water and drowned her.
Not 20 of these Protestants of that parish escaped the merciless hands of the rebels. But all the rest, being a great multitude, were all murdered and put to death. Some by burning, some by drowning, some by hanging, some by famishing or starving, some by the sword, torture, or other cruel deaths. So endeth your statement. You come forward, please.
Some of the evidence in those depositions shows the Irish rebel commanders to have been humane and considerate with their prisoners. And it seems, on the whole, that atrocities were committed as a result of wild indiscipline rather than policy. On the other hand, if you're having an atrocity inflicted on you, it doesn't help much to know it's only indiscipline and not policy. On balance, historians seem to think that about 12,000 Protestant men, women and children were either murdered or died of their privations in the early stages of the 1641 rebellion. But the real point is that it's the exaggerated versions that have counted in Ireland as much as the truth. In the Northern Irish Protestant historical subconscious, there's no limit to the horrors that might have been or might still be inflicted on them. Remember, the 1641 rebellion took place when Protestants were far outnumbered by the Catholics they lived among, and the Northern Irish Protestant attitude today is still conditioned by the fact that they are a minority in the whole of Ireland, rather than by the fact that they're now a majority in the north.
This day of Ulster's danger can be like the Britain of 1941. It can be our finest hour as we face the combined forces of atheistic communism, religious bigotry in every and any form, corrupted forms of politics, militant republicanism, secularism, and sheer pagan materialism. Loyalty to our sovereign and civil and religious liberty for all. These principles, either the very essence of democracy, and are under constant attack from the forces of evil throughout the world. And nowhere is that more apparent than in this, our beloved province of Ulster. You know, we still have the open and the avowed enemies of Irish Republican Romanism and of godless communism, which our fathers recognized and opposed in their day and generation.
Quite apart from the atrocities and their effect on Ulster, the rebellion of 1641 had another all-important effect on the way things were to go in Ireland. The Gaelic Irish had risen in the Catholic cause as well as the cause of their own lands lost to the new settlers. But the old English settlers in Ireland were Catholic too, like the Gaelic Irish. And as the English Parliament became more and more Puritan, moving as it was towards a civil war with the king, as Parliament became more and more zealously anti-Catholic, all Catholics in Ireland, Gaelic and Old English, became more and more anxious that their religion would prejudice their rights to land. In other words, the two Catholic groups in Ireland came together to form a self-protective alliance that was slightly uneasy at first, but strong and all-important for the future. That religious faith rather than racial origin was deciding allegiances in Ireland is shown by what happened here at Clongowes in the Great Rebellion of 1641. Clongowes, once a bastion of that English Pale built to ensure that the English government's writ could at least run round Dublin. The present building houses a Catholic boys' public school, and the harmony of English culture with Irish Catholic zeal is apt. For in 1641, the owner here, an English Catholic, drew his sword for the Catholic religion and Ireland against the English government in Dublin. Here Protestants committed atrocities, slaughtering women and children on the estate, hanging the garrison, and smashing open the jaws of the 90-year-old mother of the owner to get at the key to a secret room which she held in her mouth. Such were some of the awful events that were now gradually hammering the people of Ireland into two nations, one Catholic and one Protestant. It was the Catholic people of Ireland who were eventually to dominate Irish identity.
I have kept the faith. That has been the ambition of the Irish down the centuries, through persecution and through poverty, in famine and in exile. You have kept the faith. For many, it has meant martyrdom. Here at Drogheda.
Here at Drogheda, a name enters Irish history that has still not left it: Cromwell. Because here at Drogheda, in the name of English government, Cromwell carried out one of his most ruthless deeds. Cromwell had won his civil war against the king in England, but in Ireland there were still strong royalist armies, English royalists allied with Irish Catholics. Cromwell had come to break them all.
I have come with the assistance of God to hold forth and maintain the lustre of English liberty in a land where we had undoubted right to it.
Cromwell came over, wrote someone who experienced it, and like a lightning passed through the land. And he struck first here at Drogheda. And you really can't call this a simple racial anti-Irish action, as nationalist legend has sometimes had it, because the commander of the garrison here was a veteran English soldier, and many of his officers were English royalists fighting the Civil War still here in Ireland, and now in common cause with Irish Catholic rebels. Cromwell had brought over modern siege artillery, superior to anything that was then in Ireland, and he put his guns on the high ground over there across this sort of ravine. With 200 to 300 cannon shot, he succeeded in making a breach. But his first attempt to storm the breach was driven off with some loss of men, and it was this setback which seems to have inflamed Cromwell, so that when his men did eventually succeed in breaking in, he behaved as he did.
Being in the heat of the action, I forbade them to spare any that were in arms in the town.
Women and children inevitably got caught up in the process. Attacking in person, sword in hand, Cromwell and his men, in the final assault, drove the defendants back through this churchyard here to a fortified hill over there known as Millmount. Trapped here, the English commander and his officers surrendered, but were immediately put to the sword, though that's something of a euphemism where the commander himself is concerned, because he, Sir Arthur Aston, was, it's said, actually beaten to death with his own wooden leg, because, it's said, Cromwell soldiers believed that he had money concealed in it. The part of the garrison that had temporarily managed to escape crossed the river down there into the other part of the town and took refuge, some of them, in St. Peter's Church, the tower of St. Peter's Church, which was then a wooden tower. Cromwell had it burned down, and those who fled from it were massacred. Of a party of some 120 defenders he caught in another tower and who surrendered, he later wrote,
The officers were knocked on the head, and every 10th man of the soldiers killed, and the rest shipped to the Barbados. I think we put to the sword altogether about 2,000 men.
And just to assuage any feelings of guilt or remorse he might have felt, Cromwell added,
Therefore, it is right that the Lord alone should have all the glory.
In a rather confused way, Cromwell seems to have seen himself as accomplishing the Lord's work by avenging, here in Drogheda, the atrocities of the rebellion of 1641, some 8 years before. But then Drogheda had taken no part in the rebellion of 1641. It had in fact been inside the government-administered Pale all the time, and had only been occupied by royalist troops some 2 months before Cromwell's arrival in Ireland. Now, it is possible that some of that garrison might have taken part in atrocities some 8 years before, but certainly not all of them, and certainly not the English officers. Nevertheless, the effect on Ireland of this, Cromwell's final ruthless campaign of the Civil War, was devastating. In the name of English government, Irish Catholics, symbolized by the whore of Babylon, were to be trodden under, and Irish Protestants were to triumph.
I feel particularly sorry for those that believe in the Roman Catholic faith, because I think they're living in idolatry. They're living in darkness.
From Drogheda, Cromwell's Puritan parliamentary armies marched victoriously south through Ireland. Some surrendering garrisons were treated with mercy, even with honour. But one town, Wexford, suffered even worse than Drogheda. Wexford was stormed while still negotiating surrender, and Cromwell's men ran amok in the town, killing at least 2,000, of whom 200 were said to be women and children slaughtered in the marketplace. Drogheda and Wexford were burned into the folk memory of Southern Irish Catholics as part of the curse of Cromwell. After Wexford, the rest of the Parliamentary Army's campaign against the Irish Royalist and Catholic forces was quite soon over. When it was over, Cromwell acted ruthlessly against those defeated Irish Catholics who owned land. To his soldiers and to adventurers who'd financed his campaigns, he gave Catholic land, and he transplanted the Catholic owners beyond the River Shannon to the more barren areas of the province of Connaught. With this final humiliation of the Irish Catholic landowners, their banishment to a remote corner of their own country in the beautiful, sad lands of the West, the curse of Cromwell was complete. Only the landowners were transplanted. The rest of the population stayed behind as tenants and landless labourers of the new Protestant settlers. Yet the transplantation to Connaught was a symbol of humiliation to all Irish Catholics everywhere. The curse of Cromwell marked them all. The percentage of the land of Ireland owned by Catholics had shrunk anyway by the time of the Great Rebellion to 59%. As a result of the Cromwellian land settlement, it shrank to 22%. As a result of further Catholic humiliation in great events to come, it was to shrink by 1695 to 14%, and by 1714 still further to a mere 7%. When the restored monarch Charles II replaced the Cromwellian regime in 1660, Irish Catholics hoped he'd restore them to their former status too. But he was far too wily to upset the Protestants who'd given him back his crown. With his brother James II, a Catholic, on the throne in 1685, Irish Catholics felt their moment had come. James gave Catholics high offices of state and set about revoking the Cromwellian land settlement. Before he could do this, James was kicked out of England by an English revolution. But he was still king in Ireland. The city of Londonderry, symbol today of Irish Protestant determination to stand firm against the Irish Catholic majority in Ireland. Londonderry, where the Protestant cry of no surrender still echoes down 3 centuries of Irish history. Londonderry, where the Northern Irish Protestants ring out today from their 17th century cathedral their implacable message, "What we have, we hold." For it was here in 1688, as the citizens of that day heard how England was replacing the Catholic King James II with the Protestant William of Orange, that on the walls of Londonderry, the crisis this meant in Ireland was played out. And the crisis is reenacted here every year on the anniversary of these great events. Protestants of Londonderry, with their sashes and other ceremonial equipment, begin to assemble. Their links with their Scottish settler ancestry of that day proudly stressed. The march on which these descendants of those Scottish settlers are about to start celebrates the action of 13 apprentice boys of the city of Londonderry in 1688. Apprentice boys who helped save Londonderry and Ireland for William of Orange. In 1688, tension mounted as a story came that Catholic supporters of James II against William of Orange were massacring Protestants, as in 1641. And news, too, that a new garrison was being sent to the city in King James's name, a Catholic regiment of Lord Antrim's Redshanks. So these Catholic troops, the Redshanks, are marching towards the gates of Derry when this terrifying rumour that Catholics are once again about to turn on the Protestants reaches the citizens of Londonderry. Voices are heard saying it would be madness at such a moment to let Catholic troops like that in to garrison the town. Other voices, shocked, declare that it would be unthinkable to try and keep what are, after all, the royal troops out of a royal garrison. The Presbyterians in the town, with their independent attitude to authority, are untroubled by such scruples. But the Anglican Protestant establishment, while firm Protestants, are above all loyal to the crown, and they're among those who say it would be wrong not to admit the troops of the man who is still king in Ireland. The official decision, in fact, is to let the troops in the normal way.
When suddenly 13 apprentice boys of the city of Derry take matters into their own hands. They seize the keys of the gates of Derry and slam them firmly in the face of Lord Antrim's Redshanks.
A few months later, James himself arrives before the walls. He is refused admittance. The siege of Londonderry is on. To try and relieve it, there arrive from England ships which enter the River Foyle, but which, on judging the city's chances hopeless, timidly withdraw. Later, other English ships are deterred by a wooden boom placed here across the Foyle, and the situation of Londonderry seems hopeless. Including refugees brought in from the countryside all round, there were now some 30,000 Protestants taking shelter behind these walls. Walls in which modern barbed wire shows evidence of another siege in our own time. These 1689 Protestants crowded in here must have seemed a sitting target to James's Catholic armies positioned over there across what is now the Bogside on the rising ground leading up to today's Cregan Estate. And it was from up there that the Catholic army, which was surprisingly ill-equipped to conduct a siege, bombarded the city. Houses were set on fire, but the Protestant garrison and citizens successfully repelled all direct assaults on the walls.
James's armies had no proper siege guns at all at first, and then only later one gun, a 24-pounder, that was capable of doing any sort of damage to these walls. James's armies did, however, have mortars, and these mortars did much damage to houses in the town, Derry giving back as good as it got with its guns mostly positioned on the walls, though two of them were placed on the roof of the cathedral. But the fires the mortars started in the town and the damage to houses did result in great hardship in an overcrowded city short of food. Just how short of food can be seen in this Derry Museum from a shopping list of one of the last weeks of the siege. A quarter of a dog, fattened by eating the bodies of the slain Irish, 5 and 6. A dog's head, 2 and 6. A cat, 4 and 6. A rat, a shilling. A mouse, 6pence. A quart of horse's blood, 1 shilling. And this comment of the time gives a further glimpse of what the diet must have been like. Our necessity of eating the composition of tallow and starch did not only nourish and support us, but was an infallible cure for the looseness. There's an account in here of one particularly fat citizen who didn't dare to go out of his house for 3 days because he fancied that several of the garrison were eyeing him with a greedy look. Not that the thing was any sort of a joke. thousands of people died of starvation and disease. This object, preserved on a stand in the porch of Derry Cathedral, is quite literally a bombshell, one of thousands fired into Derry during the siege by James II's mortars. But this one didn't contain explosive. It had been specially emptied, in fact. What it did contain was written terms on which the besieged were invited to surrender. But it's proved explosive enough in history, because no surrender was the answer the besieged finally gave out. And no surrender it still is. Then, in 1689, the British ships in the foil, which had all the time felt held back by the wooden boom, finally summoned the courage to try and break through. Facing a continuous barrage from the Catholic Irish armies on the shore, they were watched with mounting excitement by the starving citizens. Triumphantly, the ships headed by the Mountjoy burst through the boom and sailed up with relief supplies to the very walls of Londonderry. And in triumph too, and a sort of grim joy, the hard-pressed citizens flocked down through the gates to greet them. The siege of Londonderry was over, to become, it seems, until such time as the River Foyle runs dry altogether, a sacred memory for the Protestants of Northern Ireland. But enshrined with that glorious cry of no surrender, the memory too of those British ships in the Foyle that had for so long seemed to lack the courage to come to Derry's aid. In reality, but for the arrival of British help, Derry would have surrendered. In Derry, there were people already negotiating for surrender. But the only reality which history has allowed to count is that Derry did not surrender. That, and the lesson for the Northern Protestant, that however much he may need British aid, he is, in the long run, always on his own. And it's in that sense that, in the minds of many people in Northern Ireland today, the siege of Derry is still not over, though it was raised 3 centuries ago. The raising of the siege was followed within a year by the arrival in Ireland of the Protestant King William III himself, who landed by Carrickfergus Castle near Belfast on June the 14th, 1690. He was soon after to win a great victory at the Battle of the Boyne. The Boyne finished James II. Next year, the Catholic armies in Ireland totally surrendered. And the triumph of William of Orange at the Boyne laid the foundation of that triumph of Protestant over Catholic, the memory of which is still perpetuated by Protestants in Northern Ireland today. The triumph of Orange over Green. It's a memory of triumph which the Protestants of Northern Ireland still need as part of their everyday lives. But why do they still need it? What do William of Orange and the Boyne still mean to them?
What does he mean to me? Well, he's the King of England. He was at the head of the Protestant Church. And I happen to be an Orange man, so we must mean a lot to me. So I say, as far as I'm concerned, he saved the Protestant people from getting now prosecuted and murdered by Rome. Hippies, as they're called here.
In their history book, Papists are the people on whom the gates of Derry had to be slammed and from whom the relieving ship Mountjoy delivered. People against whom these Protestants still feel they have to defend themselves.